Chapter 13 of Caroline the Illustrious, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Caroline the Illustrious, Volume 2 by William Henry Wilkins. Caroline's Last Regency, 1736. The Prince of Wales's marriage over, the king became very impatient to return to Hanover. The pledge he had given to Madame Walmoden last year that he would be with her on May 29th had become known to Walpole, who swore to the Queen that the king should not go if he could prevent it. The Quakers' bill was just then before Parliament, and the bishops were giving a great deal of trouble to the government in the House of Lords. The king's departure for Hanover again so soon would be another source of embarrassment. But neither Walpole's protests nor the Queen's more diplomatic representations were of any avail with the king. "I am sick to death of all this foolish stuff," said the defender of the faith to the Queen one day, when she was speaking to him about the bishop's action in the House of Lords, "and wish with all my heart that the devil may take all your bishops, and the devil take your minister, and the devil take the Parliament, and the devil take the whole island, provided I can get out of it and go to Hanover." After this, there was clearly nothing more to be said, and in the middle of May the king set out for Hanover, this time taking Horace Walpole with him as minister in attendance instead of Harrington, whom the Queen and Walpole determined should never go with the king to Hanover again. He again appointed the Queen Regent and sent a message to the Prince of Wales, telling him that wherever the Queen Regent resided, there would be apartments provided for himself and the princess. The prince resented this message, which forced him, he said, to move his household at the Queen's pleasure, and made him practically a prisoner in her palace. That was perhaps an exaggeration, but the order was evidently designed to prevent the prince and princess setting up a court of their own in the king's absence. The prince considered that his marriage gave him an additional claim to be appointed regent instead of the Queen. He therefore tried in many small ways to set her authority as regent at defiance, and he trumped up the excuse of the princess's indisposition to hinder him from occupying the same house as the Queen according to the king's command. The Queen, who suspected that this was only an evasion, came up from Richmond, where she had removed after the king left, to London to find out if the Princess of Wales were really ill. But her intention was baffled, for when she arrived she was told that the princess was in bed and could not receive her, and when the Queen insisted on being shown to her daughter-in-law's chamber, she found the room so dark that she could scarcely see her, and had to return to Richmond no better informed than when she set out. Shortly afterwards the Queen removed to Hampton Court, and with some little delay the prince and princess followed, and had their suite of apartments allotted them there. The Prince of Wales did not attend the council when the Queen broke the seals of the king's commission making her regent. He pretended that he had mistaken the hour. He tried by every possible means to discredit the Queen Regent's authority and to cultivate popularity at the expense of his parents. It was fairly easy for him to pit himself against his father, for the king's conduct in going to Hanover 2 years running, his affair with the Walmoden, and the fact that he had left unfulfilled several commissions in the army because, people said, he wished to pocket the pay himself, had made him more unpopular than ever. Some measure of this unpopularity reflected itself upon the Queen, though she, poor woman, was the greatest sufferer by the king's intrigue with the Walmoden. The Princess of Wales also suddenly discovered that she had scruples about receiving the sacrament according to the rites of the Church of England, and declared that she was a Protestant and a Lutheran. This move, which was probably made by command of the prince in order to gain the goodwill of the dissenters, gave a great deal of annoyance to the Queen, for the bishops and clergy were up in arms about it, talked loudly of the Act of Succession, and declared that if the princess would not conform to the rites of the Church of England, she would have to be sent back again to Saxe-Gotha. The Queen spoke to the prince on the subject, but he declared that he could do nothing, for when he reasoned to his wife, she only wept and talked of her conscience. However, the threat of being sent back to Saxe-Gotha effectually abolished the princess's scruples. She dried her tears and attended the services at the chapel at Hampton Court like the rest of the royal family. Yet even when they came to church, the Prince and Princess of Wales managed to show disrespect to the Queen's office as regent. They arranged always to come late, so that the princess had to push past the Queen in the royal pew, an uncomfortable proceeding so far as the Queen was concerned, for she was stout and the pew was narrow. Moreover, the arrival of the prince and princess and a numerous suite halfway through the service was exceedingly disturbing, so, after bearing with it 2 or 3 Sundays, the Queen sent word that if the princess came late, she must make her entry by another door. The princess, however, persisting, the Queen ordered a servant to stand at the main entrance of the chapel after she had gone in, and not permit anyone to pass until the service was over, which would have the effect of sending the princess round to another door, or of keeping her out of the chapel altogether. The prince, however, was equal even to this, for he told the princess that if she was not ready to go into chapel with the Queen, she was not to go at all, and so neatly avoided yielding the point. The Queen, notwithstanding all these studied slights and petty insults, was determined not to quarrel with her son, and regularly asked the Prince and Princess to dine with her once or twice a week, and sometimes invited them to music and cards in the gallery at Hampton Court in the evening. The Princess came now and then to these latter functions, the Prince never, though they both were obliged to come to dinner when the Queen asked them. These dinners could not have been pleasant to either side. They certainly were not to the Queen, who, after they were over, used to declare that the dullness of her daughter-in-law and the silly jokes of her son gave her the vapours, and she felt more tired than if she had carried them round the garden on her back. Meanwhile, the king at Hanover was enjoying himself with his enchantress, who had presented him with a fine boy, which it suited her purpose to declare was his son. The king, who was now 53 years of age, firmly believed her, and his affections became riveted to Madame Walmoden more firmly than ever. Yet he might well have doubted, for the lady had many friends to console her in his absence, and a suspicious incident occurred this summer, even while George was at Hanover. The king was staying, according to his custom, at Herrenhausen, and Madame Walmoden was living in the apartments set apart for her by the king in the Lynne Schloss. She spent most of her time with the king at Herrenhausen, returning to the Lynne at night, where she was sometimes visited by the king. The Lynne was very different then to what it is now, for it was fronted by extensive gardens on both banks of the Lynne, the gardens through which poor Sophie Dorothea used to steal, disguised, to Königsmarck's lodgings. The Walmodens' bedchamber was on the garden side of the palace, and one night a gardener, chancing to walk round the palace in the small hours, found a ladder placed immediately under Madame Walmoden's window. The man thought this must be the attempt of a burglar who had come to steal the lady's jewels, and made a careful search round the garden. He presently discovered a man hiding behind a bush, whom he immediately seized, and, shouting for the guard, had him placed under arrest. To every one's astonishment, the prisoner proved to be no thief, but an officer in the Austrian service named Schulenburg, a relative of the Duchess of Kendal's, who was on a visit to Hanover in connection with some diplomatic mission. Schulenburg protested against the indignity put upon him, which he said would be resented not only by himself, but by his master, the Emperor, and made such a fuss that the captain of the guard released him at once. Before the morning the story was all over the palace, and Madame Walmoden, who had been aroused in the night, was in a great state of agitation. But her woman's wit came to her aid. As early as 6 o'clock the next morning she ordered her coach and drove off to Herrenhausen to give her version of the affair to the king before anyone else could tell him. George was still abed when the lady arrived, but being a privileged personage, she passed the guards and made her way to his bedside. She threw herself upon her knees and besought the king, between her tears and sobs, to protect her from gross insult or allow her to retire from his court forever. She declared that she loved him not as a king, but as a man, and for his own sake alone, but wicked, envious people who were jealous of the favor he had shown her were plotting to ruin her. The king, astonished at this early visit, rubbed his eyes and asked what it all meant. She then told him about the ladder, and declared that it must have been placed there by design of a certain Madame de Litz, with intent to ruin her with the king. This Madame de Litz was also a Schulenburg, a niece of the old Duchess of Kendal. She was credited with having had intrigues with 3 generations of the Hanoverian family, the old king, George I, the present king, George II, and Frederick, Prince of Wales, before he came over to England. This was probably an exaggeration, but it is certain that she was the mistress of George II before he deserted her for the superior charms of the Walmoden. So the story had at least the element of plausibility. At any rate, the king accepted it, and ordered the captain of the guard to be put under arrest for having released Schulenburg, and sent word that he should again be apprehended. But Horace Walpole, the English minister in attendance, fearing that this might involve the king in a quarrel with the emperor, sent Schulenburg word privately to make speed out of Hanover, which he did forthwith. All sorts of versions were given of this latter incident, which quickly became known in London and was much discussed by Queen Caroline and her court. The king wrote long letters to the queen in England, telling her all about the affair, and asking her to judge it impartially for him, as he was so fond of the Walmoden that he could not judge it otherwise than partially, and if she were in doubt, he asked her to consult le gros homme, Sir Robert Walpole, who, he said, is much more experienced, my dear Caroline, in these affairs than you, and less prejudiced than myself in it. But whatever was the Queen's opinion, the King remained devoted to his Walmoden, and refused to believe any evil of her. Whether Caroline really consulted Walpole or not, it is impossible to say. But though she laughed about the incident in public, she wept many bitter tears in private, and her patience was well nigh exhausted. Caroline had no easy part to play in this, her fourth and most eventful regency. Her health had been failing for some time, and now was an ever-present trouble. The knowledge of the king's infatuation and the fear that her influence over him was waning preyed upon her mind, and she was further harassed by the covert rebellion against her authority carried on by the Prince of Wales. All these were troubles from within, but those from without were also serious. The king was never so unpopular as now, and his unpopularity reflected itself upon the government. There were discontents and disorders in different parts of the country. A riot broke out in the west of England because of the exportation of corn, and so violent were the farmers that in many districts the military had to be called out to quell the tumult. Another disturbance took place at Spitalfields among the weavers, who objected to Irishmen working there because they were willing to accept lower wages and could accustom themselves to a lower standard of living than Englishmen. A riot broke out, and many Irish were killed and others wounded. Huge mobs assembled, and again the Queen Regent had to command that the soldiers should be called out, which had the effect of diverting the rage of the weavers from the Irish to the court. They now began to curse the Germans even more loudly than they execrated the Irish, and from cursing the Germans they proceeded to cursing the king and queen, and shouting for James the Third. Eventually the soldiers quelled the riots, but not without bloodshed, and the discontent was all the more active for being driven below the surface. Another source of dissatisfaction with the people was the Gin Act, which had been passed with the object of abating the vice of drunkenness, and especially the drinking of gin by the lower classes. Gin drinking at that time was the popular habit, and was carried to such a degree that the drunkenness of the mob and the depraved and debased condition of public morals became a crying scandal. The sale of gin was carried to such an extent in the taverns that a newspaper of the time informs us, "We hear that a strong water shop was lately opened in Southwark with this inscription on the sign: Drunk for 1 penny, dead drunk for 2 pence, clean straw for nothing." The Gin Act was passed with a view to putting a stop to this sale, but without success, and the truth that people cannot be made sober by Act of Parliament was proved up to the hilt. The only result was to encourage a gang of informers who became the pest of the country. The Act came into force on September 29th, 1736, and as the date approached, ballads and lamentations of Mother Gin were sung about the streets. The signs of the liquor shops were everywhere put into mourning, and mock ceremonies on the funeral of Madam Gin were carried out by the mob. To quote from the journals, "Last Wednesday, September 29th, Several people made themselves very merry with the death of Madame Gin, and some of both sexes got soundly drunk at her funeral, of which the mob made a formal procession with torches. All over the country it was the same, and the act was practically abortive. The selling of gin was carried on just the same, sometimes publicly in the shops, more often by hawkers who sold it about the streets in flasks and bottles under fictitious names. Some of these names were odd enough, such as Cuckold's Comfort, Makeshift, The Lady's Delight, Colic and Gripe Water, and so forth. Sometimes the gin was colored with a drop or two of pink fluid and sold in bottles labeled, "Take 2 or 3 spoonfuls of this 4 or 5 times a day, or as often as the fit takes you." The act was repealed 7 years later, but the whole of its unpopularity now fell upon Walpole and the Queen Regent, especially on the latter, who certainly had urged its passing, as she wished to abate the crying scandal of drunkenness. The Prince of Wales, in his quest for popularity, sided with the people, and was said to have been seen drinking gin publicly in one of the taverns the very day the act came into force. The most serious riot of all took place, not in London or the provinces, but in Edinburgh. Scotland, though quelled for a time after the abortive rising of 1715, was still restless under Hanoverian rule, and it needed but a spark to set the discontent in a blaze. Scotland had never been reconciled to the Act of Union, and the jealousy of any interference from England was strongly resented, even by many of those who refused to acknowledge James as their king. The Porteous riots served to bring matters to a climax. These riots had their origin in a small matter. 2 smugglers named Robertson and Wilson were arrested by the officers of the Crown for robbing a collector of customs and lay in the toll booth or city jail of Edinburgh, under sentence of death. Hanging was the punishment for smuggling in those days, but practically the severity of the sentence rendered the act inoperative, and smuggling was winked at by many honest Scots who regarded these imposts as an unjust aggression upon their ancient liberties. But in this case the government determined to make an example. Great sympathy was felt for the prisoners by the people, and files were secretly conveyed to them from outside to aid their escape. The prisoners freed themselves from their manacles and cut through a bar of the window. Wilson insisted on going first, but as he was a stout man, he got fixed in the opening, and there remained, unable to move backwards or forwards. In this plight he was found in the morning, and the escape of the prisoners was defeated. Wilson was seized with self-reproach at the thought that, if it had not been for his willfulness, Robertson, who was a younger and slimmer man, would have been saved, and he determined to do something to help him. It was the custom in those days for condemned prisoners to be taken to the Tolbooth church the Sunday before their execution and be preached at. Robertson and Wilson went, as was customary, escorted by guards, but as they were coming out, Wilson attacked the guards unexpectedly and cried to Robertson to escape. In the confusion, the latter managed to do so. He jumped over the pews and was aided by the sympathetic congregation. The generous conduct of Wilson excited great popular sympathy, but Captain John Porteous, who was in command of the city guard, a rough and brutal man, especially resented the saving of one prisoner by another, and determined that Wilson's execution should take place the next day. In this decision he was hastened by a rumor that Wilson would be rescued from the gallows by the mob. He ordered a double guard around the scaffold, and was said to have forced the unfortunate victim to wear handcuffs much too small for him as he went to the place of execution, though the latter showed him his bruised and bleeding wrists, and protested against this barbarity. "It signifies little," said Porteous brutally. "Your pain will soon be at an end." Wilson answered him in words that were afterwards remembered. "You know not how soon you yourself may have occasion to ask the mercy which you are now refusing to a fellow creature. May God forgive you." Wilson was hanged by the neck on the gibbet erected in the Grass Market, and the execution passed off quietly enough, though an enormous and threatening crowd had assembled. But when the body had hung on the gibbet for some time, some of the mob began to throw stones at the guards, and a rush was made for the scaffold to cut down the body, either to give it decent burial or to see if it could be resuscitated. Porteous, who was a violent-tempered man and was said to be half drunk, ordered the soldiers to fire upon the crowd, and even stimulated them by snatching a musket from a soldier and firing it himself. Several persons were wounded, and 6 or 7 killed on the spot. The firing was the signal for a general tumult. Porteous and his soldiers withdrew with difficulty to the guardhouse, pursued by execrations and volleys of stones. Local feeling was wholly against Porteous. He was arrested for ordering the soldiers to fire upon the citizens, several of whom had taken no part in the tumult. His trial took place before the High Court of Justice in Edinburgh, and he was found guilty and condemned to death. He was to be hanged on September 8th, 1736, and meanwhile lay in the Tolbooth. He appealed to London, and the Queen Regent in council, taking into consideration the provocation which Porteous had received, ordered his reprieve. When this reprieve arrived at Edinburgh from the Secretary of State's office under the hand of the Duke of Newcastle, the agitation that arose was almost beyond belief. The people who had been thirsting for the death of Porteous were like tigers balked of their prey and determined to take the law into their own hands. There is little doubt that the Lord Provost and city authorities were aware of what was going to take place, and also the general in command of the troops at the castle. They did nothing to prevent it, for their sympathies were with the people. The night after the Queen's reprieve arrived in Edinburgh, a fierce mob arose as if by magic, armed with pikes, bayonets, Lochaber axes, and any arms they could find, and headed by a man dressed in women's clothes. The rioters made themselves masters of the gates of the city, disarmed the guard, and marched to the Tolbooth with shouts of "Porteous! Porteous!" The unhappy man within, who was entertaining a party of boon companions on the cheerful news of his reprieve, saw the glare of the torches, heard the cries, and recognized in them the shout of his doom. His friends made off as fast as they could. The turnkeys were seized with panic and ran away, and many prisoners escaped. Porteous concealed himself in the chimney of his cell. For some time the old door of the Tolbooth, which was of stout oak, heavily clamped with iron, resisted the onslaughts of the rioters, but at last they burned it down, and leaping over the embers, rushed into the prison in search of their prey. The miserable man was soon discovered, dragged from the chimney, carried outside, and hanged in the sight of the mob from an improvised gibbet made of a barber's pole. The crowd then dispersed as suddenly and mysteriously as it had assembled. The method and precision with which the ringleaders carried out their work, and the celerity with which they dispersed, showed there was method in this rough justice, and that it was rather the result of a conspiracy than an ordinary riot. The next morning not a sign remained of the night's dread work except the body of Porteous hanging from the pole. When the news reached London, the Queen was furious at the insult which she conceived had been especially aimed at her authority as regent, and gave vent to language which for vigor would have done credit to her exemplar, Queen Elizabeth. For the only time on record, Caroline thoroughly lost her temper. She hastily summoned a council and proposed the wildest measures. The charter of Edinburgh, she said, must be withdrawn. The provost must be incapacitated from ever holding office again. The commander of the garrison must be cashiered, and fines and imprisonment were to be the order of the day. The Duke of Argyll endeavored to put in a moderating word on behalf of his countrymen. The Queen turned on him with fury, and said that sooner than brook such an insult she would make Scotland a hunting ground. "In that case, madam," said the Duke with a bow, "I will take leave of your majesty, and go down to my own country to get my hounds ready." Caroline recognized the covert threat in the Duke's words, and adjourned the council. Fortunately, her anger was not of a kind to last long, and wiser counsels prevailed. The Scottish peers defended their countrymen in the House of Lords, and in the end a compromise was arrived at, by which the city of Edinburgh had to pay a nominal fine of £2,000, and the provost was disgraced. It was on the Porteous riots that Sir Walter Scott wrote his celebrated novel, The Heart of Midlothian. He introduces Queen Caroline in connection with Jeanie Deans, who walked all the way from Edinburgh to London to plead the cause of her sister, Effie Deans, who was sentenced to death according to Scottish law for concealing the birth of her illegitimate child. The father of this child, according to Scott's romance, was Robertson, the prisoner who had escaped, and who was supposed to have headed the mob against Porteous. Of course, in a novel a good deal of fiction is reared on a slender basis of fact, and Scott makes some little mistakes. For example, in the Queen's interview with Jeanie Deans, he makes Lady Suffolk be in attendance instead of Lady Sundon, Mrs. Clayton, whereas Lady Suffolk had left the court 2 years before. He also places the Queen's palace at Richmond, where the interview took place, in Richmond Park, whereas it was in Richmond Gardens. But this much at least is true, and may be quoted as one of the many instances of the Queen's kindness of heart. A certain Scottish peasant woman named Helen Walker actually did walk from Edinburgh to London to plead with the Queen Regent on behalf of her sister, then lying under sentence of death in the toll booth in Edinburgh. The sister, who was called Isabella or Tibby Walker, had secretly given birth to an illegitimate child, which shortly afterwards died, and by the Scottish law of those days she was adjudged, by wilfully concealing her condition, to have been guilty of its death. At the trial of this wretched girl, her sister Helen, a rigid Presbyterian, was unwillingly the principal witness against her sister. When she was asked whether Tibby, whom she dearly loved, had ever made known to her the fact of her condition, she refused to perjure herself by saying that she had, saying, "It is impossible for me to swear a falsehood," and thus gave away her sister's sole chance of release. According to the Scottish law, 6 weeks had to elapse between the sentence and the execution, and in that time Helen Walker got up a petition praying the Queen for her sister's reprieve, signed by some of the principal residents in Edinburgh, and armed with this she made her way to London on foot. Arrived there, she presented herself, clad in tartan plaid and country attire, before John, the great Duke of Argyll, who was regarded in Scotland as a protector of the poor. To him she made appeal. The Duke of Argyll told the whole story to the Queen, who was so much touched at the girl's honesty in refusing to perjure herself, and her sisterly devotion in making this long pilgrimage, that she granted the pardon at once, and Helen Walker returned with it to Edinburgh in time to save her sister. She had trusted in the Almighty's strength, she said. Whether the Queen gave audience to Helen Walker or not is uncertain. It would have been characteristic of her if she had done so, but the other facts of the case are well authenticated. These exciting public events kept the Queen Regent busy throughout the summer and early autumn, and gave her less time to think about her private troubles. But when the time drew near for the king to return to England, and he still lingered at Hanover, she became anxious, and when he wrote to say that he could not be back in England for his birthday, October 30th, as he had always done before, her tolerance and endurance began to give way. She took his absence on his birthday as a personal slight to herself, a sign to all the world that her influence over him had waned, owing to his passion for another. Her letters to the king, which were usually of great length, giving him full details of everything which took place, now became fewer and shorter, and no doubt abated proportionately in warmth. Walpole and the Queen had hitherto affected to treat the king's affair with Madame Walmoden as a joke, but now they recognized that it was beyond a joke and might become a public danger, as it already was a public scandal. They therefore put affectation aside and looked the matter in the face. Walpole repeated with even greater frankness the views he had expressed on the subject some time before, and he told the Queen that she could no longer keep the king to her side by the arts and charms she had employed when she was a younger woman. He therefore recommended that she should maintain her influence by accepting the situation and making the best of it. Since the king would not live anywhere long without his Walmoden, the Queen must go so far as to ask him to bring her to England. The Queen wept bitterly when the Prime Minister gave her this advice, but at last declared that she would do as he suggested. Walpole, profligate and cynical though he was, had his doubts at first whether the Queen, as a wife and a woman, would carry her complaisance thus far. 2 or 3 days after, when he met her walking in the gardens at Richmond, she taxed him with not believing that she would keep her promise. Walpole replied, "Madam, your Majesty, in asking if I disbelieved you, would put a word into my mouth so coarse that I could not give it place even in my thoughts. But if you oblige me to answer this question, I confess I feared." "Well," replied the Queen, "I understand what 'I feared' means on this occasion. To show you that your fears were ill-founded, I have considered what you said to me, and am determined this very day to write to the king just as you would have me, and on Monday, when we meet at Kensington, you shall see the letter." Accordingly, Caroline wrote the letter and dispatched it to her faithless husband, assuring him that she had nothing but his happiness at heart, and urging him to bring the Walmoden to England, if such a step would conduce to it. Heaven knows what mortification and anguish the Queen suffered before she brought herself to write that letter. She has been greatly blamed by the moralists for writing it, but the great excuse that can be urged for her is that her action was strongly dictated by political expediency, for the king's prolonged absence at Hanover was bringing his throne into peril. The Queen went further in her abasement, and even considered the possibility of taking Madame Walmoden into her personal service in the same position that Lady Suffolk had occupied, and so throwing an air of respectability over the arrangement. But from this Walpole dissuaded her, pointing out that it would deceive no one and defeat its object, for the world would be scandalized if the Queen made the king's mistress one of her servants, which he said was a different thing from the king's making one of the Queen's servants his mistress, as had been done in the case of Lady Suffolk. A nice distinction. The king was delighted with his Queen's complaisance, and soon sent her an answer many pages long, in which he praised her to the skies. He said that he wished to be everything that she would have him to be, but she knew his nature and must make allowances for it. "Mais vous voyez mes passions, ma chère Caroline. Vous connaissez mes faiblesses. Il n'y a rien de caché dans mon cœur pour vous, et plus adieu que vous pourriez me corriger avec la même facilité que vous m'approfondissez, plus adieu que je pourrais vous imiter autant que je sais vous admirer, et que je pourrais apprendre de vous toutes les vertus que vous me faites voir, sentir et aimer." The king then gave for the Queen's delectation a detailed description of the Walmoden's personal charms, over which Caroline must have made a wry face. He desired that Lady Suffolk's lodgings should be made ready for her, as she would avail herself of the Queen's kind permission to make her home in England. The Queen showed the king's letter to Walpole, and said, "Well now, Sir Robert, I hope you are satisfied. You see this minion is coming to England." But Walpole shook his head, and said that he did not believe she would come, for she was afraid of the Queen. He had probably received advices from his brother Horace at Hanover, telling him that Madame Walmoden was not such a fool as they thought her. His surmise proved correct, for though the Queen made ready the lodgings, the Walmoden thought discretion the better part of valor, and remembering the fate of Lady Suffolk, wisely elected to stay at Hanover. The question whether Madame Walmoden would come or not agitated the court, especially the Queen's household. Some declared that it would be an outrage and do infinite harm. Others inclined to the opinion that it would be better to bring her over, for if she kept the king so long in Hanover, thus exasperating the English people, he would go there once too often, and the nation would never let him come back. The scandal gradually filtered down through the court to the people. They did not understand why the king's absence should be so prolonged, and sought a cause. No one wanted him back for his own sake, but it was said that trade suffered because the king was not in London, and the disaffected seized upon his predilection for Hanover as a pretext for their disaffection. Many honest people pitied the Queen, a virtuous matron, they declared, who should not be used so ill, and they thought it was ridiculous for the king at his age, close on 60, with a wife and family, to be playing the gallant, when he ought to be setting an example to the nation. The most extraordinary bills and satires were printed and posted up in different parts of the town. One ran to this effect: "It is reported that His Hanoverian Majesty designs to visit his British dominions for 3 months in the spring." On the gate of St. James's Palace a more daring bill was posted: "Lost or strayed out of this house a man who has left a wife and 6 children on the parish. Whoever will give any tidings of him to the churchwardens of St. James's parish, so that he may be got again, shall receive 4 shillings and 6 pence reward. Nota bene, this reward will not be increased, nobody judging him to deserve a crown." One day in the city an old broken-down horse was turned out with a ragged saddle on its back and a woman's pillion stuck up behind it. On the horse's forehead was fastened this inscription: "Let nobody stop me. I am the king's Hanoverian equipage going to fetch his majesty and his W to England." In the autumn the Queen removed her court from Hampton Court to Kensington. The king sent her word from Hanover that she could go to St. James's if she liked, but as she was afraid of arousing his jealousy by keeping too much state, or perhaps because she did not care to show herself much in public under present circumstances, she declined and only went to St. James's to celebrate the king's birthday. The displeasure at his absence was very marked at the birthday drawing-room. The attendance was meagre, and the clothes positively shabby. The Queen affected to notice nothing unusual, but the Prince of Wales openly expressed his approval of these signs of dissatisfaction, and deliberately played on his sire's unpopularity to make himself more popular. But though the Queen was outwardly calm, she was inwardly much concerned, and she made representations so urgent to the king that at last he gave the long-deferred orders for the royal yacht to set out for Holland. On December 7th, 1736, after giving a ball and a farewell supper at Herrenhausen, the king tore himself away from Hanover and his Walmaden. He arrived 4 days later at Helvoetsluis, where the yacht was awaiting him. His daughter, the Princess of Orange, lay in a very perilous childbed at the Hague, and had urgently asked her father to come and see her on his way home. But the king would not leave his mistress a few hours sooner, so as to give himself time to visit his daughter. It was soon known in London that the king had set out from Hanover, and the Queen anxiously awaited his return, she being the only person in England who really cared whether he came back or not. But a great storm arose at sea, which lasted for many days, and the king came not, nor any tidings of him, though 100 messages a day passed between St. James's Palace, where the Queen was, and the Admiralty. No one knew whether the king had embarked at Helvoetsluis or not, but it was thought certain that, if he had embarked, his vessel must go down, as no ship could withstand the tremendous seas then running. As the days went by and no news came, the suspense at court became great. Wagers were freely laid on whether the king was drowned or not. Many people opined that he was, and the wish was often father to the thought. the Prince of Wales went about everywhere, showing himself freely to the people. When the Queen's anxiety was at its worst, he gave a dinner to the Lord Mayor and aldermen, and made them a speech which was loudly praised. The Queen, who was greatly incensed that the Prince should give this dinner at such a time, asked particulars about it the next morning, and when she was told how well it had passed off, and how popular the Prince was becoming, she exclaimed, "My God, popularity always makes me sick, but Fritz's popularity makes me vomit. I hear that yesterday, on his side of the house, they talked of the king's being cast away with the same sang-froid as you would talk of a coach being overturned, and that my good son strutted about as if he had been already king." Walpole and his friends about the court were much exercised as to what would happen to the Queen if the king were really drowned and the prince ascended the throne. Walpole declared that he, the prince, would tear the flesh off her bones with hot irons. So much did he hate his mother. Lord Hervey, on the other hand, thought that he would probably make use of the Queen's great knowledge and experience in the management of affairs, and her position would not become so intolerable as some imagined. The Princess Caroline differed from him. "My good lord," she said, "you must know very little of him if you believe that, for in the first place he hates mamma, in the next he has so good an opinion of himself that he thinks he wants no advice, and of all advice no woman's." She also said that the moment he was king, she would run out of the house au grand galop. But the Queen declared that she would not budge an inch before she was compelled to go. This uncertainty continued for more than a week, and one morning the Prince of Wales, with a satisfaction he could ill conceal, came to the Queen with the news that he had received a letter from a correspondent near Harwich, saying that the night before guns had been heard at sea, signals of distress, and part of the fleet that escorted the king's yacht had been dispersed. The poor Queen passed a day of the greatest anxiety and depression, but at night a king's messenger, who had been 3 days at sea, and had landed by a miracle at Yarmouth, arrived at the palace with a letter from the king, telling the Queen that he had not yet stirred out of Helvoetsluis. Directly the Queen read the letter, she cried out to the whole court, "The king is safe! The king is safe!" with a joy that showed how greatly she had feared. The Queen's satisfaction did not last long. A few days later, the wind having calmed, it was understood that the king had embarked. Suddenly the gales arose, fiercer than before, and everybody thought that he was at sea and in great danger. No word of the king reached the court for 10 days more, and then a vessel that had set out with the king from Helvoetsluis and continued with the fleet until the storm arose, brought news that the royal yacht had been seen to tack about, but whether to return to the harbor or not it was impossible to say. The tempests continued to rage with unabated violence, and from accounts that reached the court of guns of distress and shipwrecks, there seemed little doubt that the king by now was at the bottom of the sea. The Queen lost all hope and broke down and wept bitterly. In the prince's apartments everything wore a subdued air of excitement. Messengers ran to and fro, and it was said that the prince already considered himself King of England. The Queen, hearing this, roused herself and determined to put a bold face on the matter, and on Sunday, December 26th, she went to the chapel royal as usual. She had not been in chapel more than half an hour when a letter arrived from the king telling her that it was true he had set out from Helvoetsluis, but owing to the violence of the tempest he had put back again with great difficulty into port, where he still was detained by contrary winds. It afterwards transpired that the king had insisted on going forward, and only the good sense of the admiral in command of the fleet, who flatly refused to obey orders, saved his life. The queen now wrote to the king, telling him all her hopes and fears and sufferings. She also told him of the prince's conduct when it was thought that he was drowned, and how the different courtiers and ministers behaved. The king wrote a letter of great length in answer, full of the most passionate tenderness. He no longer dilated on the charms of the Walmoden, but on those of the queen, expressing his impatience to rejoin her, and depicting her as a perfect Venus. The queen could not forbear showing this letter to Walpole, who had told her so frankly that her beauty had gone, and said, "Do not think because I show you this that I am an old fool and vain of my person and charms of this time of day." But it was evident that she was very much pleased. There was no popular enthusiasm about the king's safety, and one of the topical jests was, "How is the wind with the king? Like the nation against him?" While the king was still away, awaiting at Helvoetsluis for the wind to change, a great fire broke out at the temple, and the Prince of Wales went at midnight to help extinguish it. He was hailed by the crowd with shouts of "Crown him! Crown him!" and the same cry was heard when he appeared at the theatre. However, any immediate question of crowning him was put at rest by the return of the king, who arrived at St. James on January 15th, 1737, after a detention at Helvoetsluis of 5 weeks and an absence from England of more than 8 months. The queen, accompanied by all her children, including the Prince of Wales, went down to the courtyard of the palace to receive him as he alighted from his coach. The king embraced her with great affection, and then gave her his arm to conduct her upstairs. A council was held the same day, and the queen surrendered into the king's hands her office of regent. End of chapter 13. Read by Brian Fullen, Plano, Texas, December 2024.
Section 14 of Caroline the Illustrious, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Kristen Hand. Caroline the Illustrious, Volume 2, by William Henry Wilkins. The Prince and the Patriots, 1737. The king's narrow escape from drowning really seemed to have given him a lesson, for he behaved much better on his return to England than he had done before he went to Hanover. He treated the queen with great affection and respect, and praised her frequently before all the court. He no longer abused England and extolled Hanover, and he did not so much as mention Madame Walmoden. Perhaps the state of his health had something to do with his change of conduct. He had contracted a chill on his journey home, which soon after his return developed into a low fever. For some time the king was very unwell. He kept to his own apartments and saw no one but the queen, and when it was absolutely necessary, Walpole. Exaggerated rumors soon spread abroad concerning his condition, though the king himself, the queen, and the princesses made light of it. Still the king grew no better, and at last the ministers became anxious, and Walpole taxed the queen with concealing the king's true state of health, an imputation which she indignantly denied. The Prince of Wales and his friends declared that the king's constitution had quite broken up, and even if he recovered from this illness, it was unlikely that he would long survive. This was a little too much for the king, and by way of showing that he was not dead yet, he roused himself from his lethargy, quitted his chamber, and resumed his levees. It was noticed that he looked pale and thin, and it was generally thought he would not live long, though, as a matter of fact, he grew better every day after he quitted his chamber. The king's ill health had the result of bringing the Prince of Wales more prominently before the public. It was felt by many courtiers and politicians that his coming to the throne was only a question of a little time, and they were anxious to stand well with him. The alliance between the prince and the Patriots now became closer, and the prince gave the opposition his open support in return for their championing his grievances, which he had determined to have redressed by fair means or foul. He had written, or caused to be written, L'Histoire du Prince Titi, in which his wrongs were set forth in detail, and the king and queen abused under transparent pseudonyms. Translations of this work were circulated about this time and gave great offense at the court, but they influenced, to some extent, popular feeling in his favor. The prince took the leaders of the opposition into his confidence, especially rising men like Pitt and Lyttelton. Perhaps it was these younger and more fiery spirits who urged him to act upon the advice of Bolingbroke and set the king at defiance, though it was generally supposed that Chesterfield prompted him. Certain it was that the prince saw in his father's illness an opportunity of bringing his claims before Parliament, and determined to delay no longer. The prince requested the leaders of the opposition to raise the question in the House of Commons. Some were at first reluctant, but influenced, no doubt, by the king's ill health, Pulteney at last consented to bring forward the question, and Wyndham and Barnard agreed to support him. When the king and queen heard the news, they were thrown into an extraordinary state of agitation. The king was beside himself with rage, and the queen declared that all these disputes would kill her. The government, too, were in a difficult position. The prince's demand that he should have his £100,000 a year and a dowry for the princess was, on the face of it, reasonable, and, what was more important, popular. Ministers could not be sure of their majority and might suffer defeat. Walpole endeavored to effect a compromise, and after great difficulty induced the king to send a message to the prince the day before the motion came on in the House, saying he was prepared to settle £50,000 a year on him absolutely, and to give the princess a dowry. The prince declined to consider the message, saying that the matter was in other hands. The next day, February 22nd, 1737, Pulteney brought forward his motion in a moderate speech, basing his main argument on precedent and the right of the heir apparent to the crown to enjoy a sufficient and settled income. Walpole, in his reply, laid stress upon the king's message to the prince the previous day, as showing how far the king was anxious to meet his son's wishes. He held that parliamentary interference between father and son would be highly indecorous. In the end, the prince's claims were rejected by a majority of 30. This small majority really would have been reduced to a minority if 45 Tories with Jacobite leanings had not left the House in a body, unwilling to give any vote in favor of the heir of Hanover, even though by doing so they would defeat the government. The king and the queen were overjoyed at the prince's defeat, and in the first flush of victory the king was inclined to follow up his advantage by turning his son immediately out of St. James's Place, in the same way as, he might have remembered but did not, his father had turned him out. Walpole dissuaded the king from taking so extreme a step, and then proceeded to urge him to make good his promise to settle a jointure on the princess, and make over £50,000 a year to his son absolutely. To this the king now demurred, though Walpole pointed out to him that the victory in the House of Commons had only been gained on the understanding that the king would carry out his pledges. The difficulty was complicated by the prince continuing impenitent. So far from being downcast by his defeat in the House of Commons, he called a council of all his friends, and it was resolved to raise the question anew in the House of Lords, Lord Carteret undertaking to bring forward the motion and Chesterfield to support it. Here too he lost, but public sympathy was undoubtedly with him, and to prevent the scandal from growing, Walpole, Newcastle, and indeed all the king's ministers urged the necessity of a settlement. One was eventually made, though not until much later, by the king settling £50,000 a year on the prince absolutely, together with £10,000 a year from the Duchy of Cornwall, and Parliament making up the rest by giving an unusually large jointure to the Princess of Wales. The king and queen were much disgusted at what they considered the government's half-heartedness, and included in their displeasure the Whigs generally, who had certainly wavered in their devotion to the court when they heard that the king's health was so bad. "If the Whigs can be so little depended upon in the king's interest," said the Queen, "we might as well send for the Tories, who are only too willing to come. The king has only to beckon them." She did not mean what she said, but Walpole became alarmed. His majority was not so large that he could pose any longer as a dictator, or afford to dispense with the king's favour and support. He knew that Lady Sundon was intriguing against him, and that she had had several interviews with Lord Carteret. Carteret now expressed his great regret at having championed the prince's cause. He said he was driven into it against his better judgment. He was full of the Queen's praises, and vowed that he would do anything to serve her. He declared that he had great influence over the opposition leaders, especially Pulteney and Wyndham, and could bring them to the Queen's side if she would only make the sign. All this was duly repeated by Lady Sundon to the Queen, who listened but did nothing. She never intended to do anything, but she thought it well to bring Walpole to his bearings, and in this she quickly succeeded. Walpole came to her and told her that he had heard of Carteret's overtures and warned her not to trust him. The Whigs, he urged, were the natural support of the Hanoverian family, which was certainly true, since they had brought them over to England, and the Tories were but a broken reed. Caroline agreed with all he said, but fell back upon the lukewarm support which the Whigs had given the king. Even Walpole, she said, had regarded the prince's conduct in too favourable a light. Walpole told her that he had only striven to bring the prince to reason, but now he owned that he had made a mistake. The Queen, he said, should never again have cause to complain of him on that score. He saw that the prince must be overcome. The Queen said she only wanted him to assure her on that point, and she dismissed him with many assurances that she would never cease to support him. The immediate result of this reconciliation was to strengthen the alliance between the prince and the Patriots, who now saw in Frederick their only hope of ever gaining office. These events took place quite early in the session, but when Parliament rose, the king said nothing about going to Hanover as ministers had feared. In truth, he was afraid to go, for he knew that Frederick would seize upon it as a pretext for some fresh intrigue, and the country was hardly in a humour to brook another prolonged absence. So he rarely mentioned the name of Hanover and never that of Walmoden. Most people about the court thought that the king had forgotten her for Lady Deloraine, to whom he showed great attention, paying her visits in her apartments for a long time together, as he had done to Lady Suffolk in the old days. He also insisted on her sitting next to him at the commerce table, and often walked with her tete-a-tete in the gardens. Lady Deloraine, who had great beauty but little discretion, was inclined to boast of her triumphs, for she said to Lord Hervey, "Do you know the king has been in love with me these 2 years?" Lord Hervey, who was afraid to invite dangerous confidences, merely smiled and said, "Who is not in love with you?" Walpole came across her one day, standing in the hall at Richmond with a baby in her arms, and said to her, "That is a very pretty boy, Lady Deloraine. Whose is it?" She replied, "Mr. Wyndham's," her husband's, "upon my honour. But," she added with a significant laugh, "I will not promise whose the next shall be." She, moreover, told several people that the king had been importunate a long time, but that she had held out from motives of virtue, which were not at all appreciated, as her husband, she was sure, did not care. Whether there was anything between Lady Deloraine and the king or not, the Queen followed her usual policy of ignoring the intrigue. She knew what her husband was, and made allowances. Perhaps, too, she was glad that he should seek distraction from Madame Walmoden, though she knew that he had not forgotten her. Walpole had told her of an incident which showed how the king still esteemed his Hanoverian mistress above Lady Deloraine. He ordered Walpole one day to buy 100 lottery tickets and to charge the amount, £1,000, to the Secret Service Fund instead of his civil list. Walpole did as he was bid and told Hervey of this iniquitous transaction, which he said was for the benefit of the king's favourite. Hervey thought he meant Lady Deloraine and expressed his surprise at the largeness of the sum, saying he did not think His Majesty went so deep there. Walpole replied, "No, I mean the Hanover woman. You are right to imagine he does not go so deep to his lying fool here. He will give her a couple of the tickets and think her generously used." The relations between the Prince of Wales and his parents went from bad to worse as the months wore on, but they were not even yet strained to the breaking point. Acting on the advice of his supporters, the prince still occasionally attended levees and drawing-rooms. The king treated him as though he were not in the room. The Queen, though she recognized his presence, did not speak to him more than was absolutely necessary, and in private she declared that she was afraid to do so lest he should distort her words. The prince still resided in his father's house, making his headquarters at St. James's Palace, But when the king and queen moved to Hampton Court for the summer, he had perforce to go there too, but much against his will. Though he and the princess lived under the same roof as the king and queen, they saw little of them and only met them in public. In July, the prince wrote a letter to the queen announcing that the princess was with child. The queen congratulated him and the princess on the auspicious event and asked the latter some maternal questions about her condition. To all these, the princess made the same answer: "I do not know." The queen had doubts, which were shared by her daughters, as to whether the princess was really pregnant. Both she and the king considered the prince quite capable of palming off a spurious child on them, and their prejudices against him were so strong that they half believed he was plotting to do so. They had no wish that the Princess of Wales should bear children. It was generally thought that she would not. If she did, it would destroy the remaining chance that their beloved younger son, William, might one day succeed to the crown. The prince, who resented these suspicions, wished that his wife should be confined at St. James's, but the king determined that the event should take place at Hampton Court. The queen declared that at her labor I positively will be, let her lie in where she will, but again expressed herself skeptical about the princess being confined at all, as she could see no signs of it. The prince, on the other hand, who knew and resented these suspicions, vowed that his mother should not be present at the birth and that the child should be born at St. James's. He kept his word. The court was then at Hampton Court for the summer, and the Prince and Princess of Wales were occupying their own suite of apartments. On Sunday, July 31st, the princess dined in public with the king and queen, but on retiring to her apartments, she was seized with pain, and symptoms of premature confinement became manifest. Notwithstanding the danger, which perhaps the prince did not realize, as the princess's confinement was not expected for 2 months, he determined that she should at once be secretly removed to St. James's. He ordered his coach to be brought round quickly. It was nearly dark, and the prince's apartments were in another wing of the palace to those of the king and queen, so they were able to make their exit without being seen. The poor princess was carried downstairs, though she begged her husband to let her remain where she was, and Lady Archibald Hamilton added her entreaties, but to no effect. The prince obstinately insisted on his wife getting into the coach with Lady Archibald and one of her women. The prince got in after them and gave the order to drive with all speed to St. James's, and once outside the gates of Hampton Court, they went at a full gallop towards London. The princess moaned in agony, but the prince kept saying, "Courage, courage," telling her by way of consolation that it would all be over in a minute. They arrived at St. James's Place about 10 o'clock. There was nothing ready for them, as they were not expected. The princess, shrieking with pain, was carried upstairs and put to bed, and, there being no sheets in the palace, a pair of tablecloths had to make shift instead. Within half an hour, she was prematurely delivered of a girl child. Meanwhile, at Hampton Court, the king and queen, all unsuspecting, passed their evening as usual. The king played commerce below stairs with Lady Deloraine and the maids of honor. The queen and the Princess Amelia played quadrille above. Princess Caroline and Lord Hervey had their nightly game of cribbage. The party broke up, and all retired at 11, without having heard a whisper of what had been going on in the Prince of Wales's apartments. The king and queen had gone to bed and to sleep, when about 1:30 they were aroused by the arrival of a courier from St. James's Palace with a message that brooked no delay. The queen, startled at being aroused at so unusual an hour, asked whether the palace was on fire, but Mrs. Tichborne, her dresser, in fear and trembling, explained that the Prince of Wales had sent to let their majesties know that the princess was in labor. The queen jumped up immediately and cried out, "My God! My nightgown! I'll go to her at this moment." "Your nightgown, madam," said the worthy Tichborne. "Aye, and your coaches too. The princess is at St. James's." "Are you mad?" exclaimed the queen. "Or are you asleep, my good Tichborne? You dream." Then Mrs. Tichborne told the whole tale of the princess's flight, so far as she understood it. The king raged and swore, and began to abuse the queen, saying, "You see now, with all your wisdom, how they have outwitted you. This is all your fault. There will be a false child put upon you, and how will you answer for it to all your children? This has been fine care and fine management for your son, William. He is mightily obliged to you, and as for Anne, I hope she will come over and scold you herself. I am sure you deserve anything she can say to you." The queen made no answer, but dressed quickly, ordered her coach, and set out for London at once, accompanied by the princesses Amelia and Caroline, and attended by some of the lords in waiting. She arrived at St. James's Palace about 4 o'clock, left her coach and those who came with her at the outer gate, walked alone across the courtyard, and made her way upstairs as fast as she could. At the top of the stairs she met the prince in his nightgown. He dutifully kissed her hand and cheek, and then, with scarcely concealed malice, told her that she was too late. The princess had given birth to a daughter. The queen expressed neither surprise nor annoyance, but asked why the news of the child's birth had not been sent to her before she started from Hampton Court. The prince said that he had written letters to the king and queen directly he could. The messenger was already on the road, and she would doubtless find them on her return. The queen made no further remark, but asked to see the mother and child. The prince then conducted her into the princess's chamber. The queen kissed the princess and wished her joy, but expressed her fear that she had suffered greatly. The princess dutifully replied, "Not at all. It is nothing." Lady Archibald Hamilton brought the child, which was wrapped up in an old red mantle and some napkins, no proper clothes having yet been found for it, nor any nurse. The queen kissed the babe and said, "The good God bless you, poor little creature. You have come into a troublesome world." The prince then began a long account of what had happened. The queen listened to him without interruption, but when he had quite finished, she said that it was a miracle the princess and the child had not been killed. She added that he and his wife were a couple of young fools who could not have been aware of the danger they ran, and then she turned to Lady Archibald and said, "But for you, my Lady Archibald, who have had 10 children, that with your experience and at your age you should suffer these people to act with such a madness, I am astonished, and wonder how you could, for your own sake as well as theirs, venture to be concerned in such an expedition." To this the Lady Archibald made no reply, except to turn to the prince and say, "You see, sir." The queen then embraced the princess, wished her goodbye, and told her that if there was anything she wanted, she had only to name it, and it would be done. The princess, who had evidently been coached in her part, from between her tablecloths, thanked her majesty, but said she wanted nothing. The prince waited on his mother down the stairs, still in his nightgown, and would have escorted her to her coach, had she not insisted that he should not accompany her out of doors in such a plight. The queen walked across the courts by herself to where the coaches were waiting. She told the princesses that she had no doubt that the child was genuine, but she added, "If instead of this poor, little, ugly she-mouse there had been a brave, large, fat, jolly boy, I should not have been cured of my suspicions." As soon as the queen had set out from Hampton Court, the king sent express messengers to Walpole and Lord Harrington, requesting them to hasten to St. James to be present at the birth of the prince's child. They went thither with all speed, but like the queen, arrived too late. Walpole returned to Hampton Court in the course of the morning and had a conference with the king and queen. He agreed that the insult was intolerable and must be punished. Walpole had learnt his lesson and was now wholly against the prince. So far from attempting to moderate the king's ire, he sought rather to inflame it, and declared that if the king and queen did not conquer him, he would conquer them. After much discussion and much strong language, the king sent the prince a written message, complaining of the deliberate indignity offered to him and the queen, which he resented in the highest degree. The king was for taking more drastic measures at once, but Walpole persuaded him to defer them until the princess was out of danger, and then strike. The king would gain by waiting a little, he said, for as soon as it was known that the prince had been guilty of this grievous act of folly, his popularity would wane. In this he was right, for no sooner did the news get abroad than the public, to a man, condemned the prince's conduct in risking his wife's life and that of his unborn child in order to insult his father and mother. His friends, who had supported him through thick and thin in his endeavor to get a separate grant from Parliament, were unable to find an excuse for this rash and inconsiderate step, though they urged in palliation the prince's natural pique at the surveillance to which he had been subjected, and his ignorance of the danger the princess had run. The prince, who soon became aware that he had made a false step, called a council of his chief supporters, including Carteret, Chesterfield, and Pulteney, who frankly told him that he had put himself in the wrong, and the best thing he could do would be to patch up a reconciliation with the king and queen. In view of this, the prince, a few days later, thought he would go to Hampton Court to pay his respects to the king and queen, but the king, having got ear that he was coming, sent him a message saying he would not see him. Thereupon ensued a lengthy correspondence in which the prince would not own himself in the wrong. He expressed himself deeply grieved at having aroused the king's anger, but insinuated that the queen was really responsible for the strained relations between himself and his father. He thus struck a note which was taken up by the prince's court, and afterwards by the great body of his supporters. Afraid to strike at the king directly, they threw all the blame upon the queen, who they declared had first artfully inflamed the king's anger against his son, and now tried to keep him inflexible. It was a cowardly thing to do, as well as unjust, for the queen had always been on the side of peace. But the prince hated his mother because the king had appointed her regent instead of him, and the opposition hated the queen because she had shown herself, through storm and shine, the firm supporter of Walpole. In pursuance of this policy, when the queen, 9 days after her daughter-in-law's confinement, paid her another visit at St. James's, the prince treated his mother with marked discourtesy. He avoided meeting her at the main entrance and only received her at the door of the princess's bedchamber. He refused to speak a word to her during the whole visit, though the queen was in the room with him and her daughter-in-law more than an hour. He could not help escorting her to her coach when she left, but did it all in dumb show. Yet when they reached the coach door, and he saw that a considerable crowd had assembled, he knelt down in the muddy street and kissed her hand with every demonstration of respect. At this hypocrisy, as Horace Walpole says, her indignation must have shrunk into contempt. The queen was deeply wounded by her son's treatment, and after that she paid no more visits to St. James's. These acts irritated the king beyond endurance, and even the queen was stung out of her usual calm by the attacks made upon her. But anger and strong language availed nothing. The prince was heir to the throne, and an heir to the throne is never without friends. In Frederick's case, his friends were all the Patriots. Even Carteret, finding his overtures to the queen led to nothing, had gone back to him. The triumph of the prince would mean the triumph of the opposition too, the defeat of the king and queen, the defeat of the government. Walpole knew this and realized that if any reconciliation were brought about, he would probably have to go. It was obviously to the advantage of the royal family that these quarrels should end, and Lord Hardwicke, the Lord Chancellor, earnestly strove to bring about a reconciliation. But Walpole advised the king against it, an easy task, for the king's inclination was all for revenge. Another message, an ultimatum, was therefore composed and sent by the king, denouncing the prince's conduct in the strongest terms, and ending, "It is my pleasure that you leave St. James's with all your family." This was equivalent to a total separation. The prince received the king's message without comment, and as the orders were peremptory, 2 days later he and the princess removed from St. James's Palace to Kew. All communications between the two courts were now broken off, and shortly afterwards the prince took up his residence at Norfolk House, St. James's Square, which immediately became a rival court and the centre of the opposition, much as Leicester House had been in the reign of George I. The court of Norfolk House, though strong in numbers, was not without brilliancy. The prince had wit and pleasing manners, and was ably seconded by his young and beautiful consort. His love of letters attracted many of the ablest writers, and his political views drew around him the rising men among the Tories. The Prince of Wales's court became a focus of all the talents and a rallying place of the younger Tories, and as time went on, it influenced considerably the course of English politics. A generation was growing up in the Tory party which knew not the Stuarts, and saw a way of overthrowing the Whig ascendancy, not by the forcible restoration of James, but in the peaceable accession of Frederick. They were doomed to wander many years in the wilderness of opposition before their dreams came true, and that Whig domination was at last beaten down, not by Frederick, but by his son. But at this time Frederick's accession to the throne seemed comparatively near at hand. It was, in view of his future reign, and as a satire on his father's, that Bolingbroke composed his magnificent essay, The Ideal of a Patriot King. A sublime conception of government, but impossible to be acted upon, because it presupposed the existence of a monarch of almost superhuman wisdom and virtues. Such an idea could not be realized in Frederick, nor was it realized in his son, George III. End of chapter 14.
Chapter 15 of Caroline the Illustrious, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Katherine Seeholster. Caroline the Illustrious, Volume 2, by Henry Wilkins. Chapter 15. The Queen's Illness and Death. 1737. The Queen's health had been breaking for some time past, and nothing but her strength of will and determination not to yield kept her up. She had never really enjoyed good health since she became queen. The last 10 years had been a continual struggle against physical weakness. In the news sheets of the day, mention is frequently made of the queen's indisposition, and nearly always from a different cause. The list of her ailments and the barbarous and violent remedies resorted to makes one wonder how she survived so long. Gout, ague, rash, pleurisy, chills, colic, everything. In short, but her secret and most dangerous malady was recorded. But the Queen seldom retired for more than a day or two. She would never admit that she was really ill, and was extremely angry if anyone said that she was so. The king disliked to have sick people about him, and resented the queen's ailments as though they were invented for his special annoyance. Caroline was aware of this peculiarity on the part of her spouse, and would rather endure agonies rather than let him suspect that anything was wrong with her. She was a great sufferer from gout, which sometimes crippled her so much that she could not move without pain, but so absolute was her devotion to the king that she would plunge her swollen legs into ice-cold water in order that she might not fail to accompany him on his daily walks. These desperate remedies no doubt did her infinite harm. But she had another malady too, which false delicacy, as some described it, though it would be more correct to say wifely devotion, made her conceal. At the birth of her youngest child, Princess Louisa, in 1724, Caroline suffered a slight internal rupture. Her husband noticed it at the time, but she said it was nothing and would pass. Later, he taxed her with it again and advised her to consult a doctor, but she again denied it, this time with so much vexation, declaring that he sought a pretense for neglecting her, that the king promised never to mention it again. For a time the malady seemed to grow better, or, at any rate, to remain dormant. But of late it had been troubling her again, and neglect and concealment made it go from bad to worse. The queen took infinite pains to hide the nature of her illness, frequently consulting doctors, and leaving them in ignorance of her real malady. For years, amid the splendors of her court and the plenitude of her power, Caroline had carried with her this dread secret, and maintaining a smiling face to the world. From time to time she must have suffered agonies, but she bore them with Spartan heroism. It was only during the king's absences at Hanover that she indulged in the luxury of collapse, and then she ascribed her weakness to the gout, or any cause but the real one. She held withdrawing rooms as usual, but more than once she had to be wheeled into the presence chamber in a chair, physically unable to stand. One of these breakdowns Peter Wentworth writes, "Queen has been so ill, I went every day to the back stairs and had the general answer that she was better, but I knew they told me true and when not, and was often in great pain for my good queen. But it's not the fashion to show any at court. The first day she came out into her drawing-room, she told a lady, whom I stood behind, that she had rarely been very bad and dangerously ill, but it was her own fault, for she had a fever a fortnight before she came from Kennington. But she kept it a secret, for she resolved to appear at the king's birthday. She owned she did wrong, and said she would do so no more, upon which I made her a bow, as much as to say, I hope she would do as she then said. I believe she understood me, for she smiled upon me." In some way the queen connected the decline of her influence over the king and his passion for the Walmoden with the failing of her physical health, and she struggled against it to the death. It is no exaggeration to say that she would have died rather than let her malady become known. In fact, her concealment of it led to her death. The secret anxiety gnawing always at her heart, combined with the worry she had to endure from without and within, told upon her strength. For the last 2 or 3 years she had been on the rack daily, a martyr to physical and mental anguish. The infidelity of the king, and the unfilial conduct of the Prince of Wales, the hard work inseparable from her position, and the effort at all costs to keep brave front to the world, told upon her health, until at last she could bear the strain no longer. It was in vain that she sought relaxation in her best-loved pursuits. The haunting fear never left her day or night. Soon after the Prince of Wales had been turned out of St. James's Palace, the king and queen removed there from Hampton Court, and remained over the king's birthday, October 30th. The queen busied herself much this autumn in fitting up a new library which she had built on the stable yard of St. James. on the site now occupied by Stafford House. It was a large, handsome building, constructed on the most approved principles. The Queen was now furnishing it with cases and books. She had ordered busts of philosophers and learned men to be placed in the corridor, and had requested the English ambassadors abroad to collect for her the best Spanish, French, and Italian books to make her collection as complete as possible. When all was finished, she hoped to hold there the intellectual tournaments in which she delighted, and make the library serve the double purpose of a lecture room. She used to go there nearly every day to personally superintend the work, and it was in this library on the morning of Wednesday, November 9th, that she finally broke down. The Queen was giving some directions to the workmen when suddenly she was seized with violent internal pains. She made her way back to St. James's Palace as quickly as she could, and went to bed. At 2:00 there was to be a drawing-room. The King proposed that it should be postponed, but the Queen, who did not wish to be known that she was ill, declared that she felt much better, got up, dressed, and went to the drawing-room. She smiled and bowed as usual, and even chatted to some of the company, though she was suffering extremely, and could scarcely stand. The King noticed nothing amiss, and went on talking for a long time about some new farce that was the fashion of the hour. At last he dismissed the court, reminding the Queen, who was by this time in agony, that she had not spoken to the Premier Duchess, the Duchess of Norfolk. The Queen, as she was going out, went to the Duchess and apologized for the omission with her usual graciousness. On returning to her room, she again went to bed. The King thought it was only a temporary disposition in which belief she humored him, and he went off in the evening to play cards with Lady de Lorraine, after having sent for the German court physician to look after the Queen. Every hour the Queen became worse, and she was still bent on concealing the cause of her illness, and declared that she had the colic. She asked Lord Hervey, who was in attendance, what she should do to ease her pain. Lord Hervey, who was a chronic invalid and made himself a worse one by taking quack nostrums, recommended her a concoction called snake root, but the German physician would not let her take it, and, as the Queen was now in a high fever, he called in another doctor. In ignorance of her malady, the doctors dosed their unfortunate patient with a number of horrible concoctions, such as Daffy's elixir, Sir Walter Raleigh's cordial, Asquebat, and so forth, and then the only effect of these remedies was to make her violently sick, and sent for Ranby, the surgeon, who bled her into the bargain. The Princess Caroline, who had sat with her mother all day, now declared herself seized with rheumatic pains, and Lord Hervey, who was in his element, dosed her with another nostrum called Ward's pill, which, it is not surprised to hear, made her worse. The King came back at his usual hour, and, as much upset at finding the Queen so ill, by way of showing his anxiety, he lay on her bed all night, outside the coverlet, with the result that he spoiled his night's rest and hers too. The Queen again bled in the morning Thursday, and the fever having abated a little, it was thought that she was better, but she knew that she was not, for she said to the Princess Caroline, who, suffering from the effects of the pill, "Poor Caroline, you are very ill too. We shall soon meet again in another place." At her request, the King held a drawing-room as usual, and the Princess Amelia took her mother's place at court, and so the day wore on. Towards the evening the Queen got worse, and in her agony cried aloud to the Princess Caroline, "I have an ill which nobody knows of." But she gave no particulars, and this was regarded merely as a vague statement. 2 more physicians were called in, and further added to the Illustrious patient's discomfort by owning blisters and aparients, both without effect. The King was now greatly concerned, and sat up all night with his wife. The next morning, Friday, it was impossible to conceal any longer the fact that the Queen was seriously ill. The news reached the ears of the Prince of Wales, who was then at Kew, and he immediately hurried up to London to inquire after the Queen. The king had an idea that something of the kind would happen, and gave strict orders that if the prince came, he was not to be admitted. About an hour after the king had thus expressed himself, the prince sent Lord North to St. James with a message saying that he was much grieved to hear of the Queen's illnesses, and asking to be allowed to come and see her. But the king not only refused to let him come, but returned an answer requesting him to send no more messages to St. James. "This," said he, "is like one of the scoundrel's tricks. It is to be a piece of his kneeling down in the dirt before the mob to kiss her hand on the coach door when he came from Hampton Court to see the princess." Though he had not spoken one word to her during the whole visit, I always hated the rascal. But now I hate him worse than ever. He wants to come and insult his poor dying mother, but she shall not see him. Later in the day, the Queen, who had no knowledge of what had passed, said to the king that she wondered the prince had not asked to see her yet, and she felt sure that he would do so, because it would look well before the world. The king then told her of what had passed, and how he had forbidden the prince to come, or send any more messages, though, he added, if the Queen really wished to see her son, she could do so. But the Queen emphatically declared that she had no such wish, and the incident ended. The prince continued to send messengers to inquire throughout his mother's illness. The next day, Saturday, the Queen grew worse every hour, yet she still, with a stubbornness which is impossible to understand, concealed the true nature of her malady. Towards evening, the king, who was greatly worried, whispered to her that he believed her illness came from rupture, but she denied it with great warmth and peevishness. However, the king sent for the surgeon, Ranby, and confided his fears to him. Ranby at once examined the Queen, and even then she carried her desire for concealment so far as to declare that she felt the pain in a different part of her body to that where it really was. But the surgeon was no longer to be deceived, and having discovered the rupture, he took the king aside and told him of it, adding that the Queen was in the utmost danger. The Queen started up in bed in a state of great excitement, but when the surgeon told her bluntly that it was no longer possible to conceal the truth, she turned her face to the wall and wept silently. These were the only tears she shed throughout her illness, as there was no time to be lost. 2 more surgeons were called in, and the same evening an operation was performed. It did not give relief, nor did the doctors hold out much hope. Concealment and neglect had made the ill past remedy. The Queen passed a troubled night, and early the next morning, Sunday, she complained that her wound gave her great pain. The surgeons were summoned, and discovered that it had already begun to mortify. The dreaded news was immediately conveyed to the king, and it was feared the Queen could not live many hours. The king came at once, followed by the Duke of Cumberland and the Princess Amelia, Caroline, Mary, and Louisa. The Queen took leave of her weeping husband and children, and asked them not to leave her until she died. To the Princess Caroline, she commended the care of her younger children, and she bade her son William to be a support to his father, and try to make up for the sorrow and vexation caused by his elder brother. Of the king she took a most affectionate farewell, telling him that he knew all her thoughts, and thanking him for his love and trust of her. She commended to his care all those who were dependent on her, from the highest to the lowest. She then drew from her finger the ruby ring he had given her at the coronation, and put it upon his, saying, "This is the last thing I have to give you. Naked I came to you, naked I go from you. I had everything I ever possessed from you, and to you everything I have I return." She added one word of advice, which she said she had often given to him when she was in health, that after her death he should marry again. At this the king burst into sobs and tears, and vowed he would not, saying, "Non, non, je ris de maîtresse." The Queen replied wearily, "Mon Dieu, cela ne presque." It was the only hint of reproach that ever crossed her lips. If we accept that other bitter cry wrung from her the extremity of her anguish years before, "I have never lived a day without suffering," perhaps the king felt some pangs of remorse, for he wept over her bitterly, kissed her again and again, and uttered many endearing words. He had reason to weep, for he was losing the only being in the world who loved him, and loved him with a devotion that was as absolute as it was unaccountable. After this trying scene, the queen fell into a doze, and it was thought that she would pass away in her sleep. But, to everyone's surprise, she woke up feeling better. She now declared her belief that she would last until Wednesday, saying that all the great events of her life had happened on that day. She had been born on a Wednesday, married on a Wednesday, had her first child on a Wednesday, heard the news of the late king's death on a Wednesday, and had been crowned on a Wednesday, and therefore she would die on a Wednesday. This was the only little touch of superstition in her character. Later in the day the surgeons again examined the wound, and, finding that the mortification had not spread, declared that perhaps after all she would recover. This revived hope in all the breasts but that of the queen, who knew it to be only a reprieve. "My heart will not break yet," she said. Her reprieve gave her time to see her trusted friend and minister, Sir Robert Walpole, who arrived in haste on Monday morning from Houghton, whither he had gone 10 days previously to bury his wife. In consequence of his mourning, he had not been sent for officially, but when he heard the news of the Queen's danger, he came as fast as post-horse could bring him. The Queen had asked for him once or twice, and when the King heard that Walpole had arrived, and was in the antechamber, he at once gave him audience. Walpole was in great disorder and distress, for he had been travelling hard and fast. Despite his great bulk, he knelt down awkwardly and kissed the king's hand, and with tears asked, "How is the queen?" The king said, "Come and see for yourself, my good Sir Robert," and carried him off to the queen's bedside. The interview was very short, but the queen's words were to the point. "My good Sir Robert, you see me in a very indifferent situation. I have nothing to say to you but to recommend the king, my children, and the kingdom to your care." The queen lingered throughout Monday and Tuesday, and even the dreaded Wednesday, in much the same condition. On Thursday a change took place for the worse, and she suffered much pain, but she bore it all without a murmur, and had a smile and a cheery word for many. She even joked at Ranby, the surgeon, when he was dressing her wound, saying, "Before you begin, let me have a full view of your comical face." And whilst he was cutting her, she said, "What would you give now to be cutting up your wife?" The queen underwent many of these cuttings, and she bore all with great fortitude, and if sometimes a groan escaped her, she would beg the surgeons not to heed, and even apologize to them for some peevish expressions. Her patience and courage were marvelous, and her mind remained calm and collected. All this time the chaplain's services had not been required. Several of the bishops remarked on it, and many about the court whispered that it was not right that the queen should remain without the consolations of religion. At last representatives were made to Walpole, who irregularly shrugged his shoulders, but he asked the Princess Amelia to acquaint the king and queen with what was being said, and suggested that the Archbishop of Canterbury, Dr. Potter, should be sent for. The Princess Amelia, who knew her mother's view on religious matters, at first demurred to taking the message, but afterwards went to the king, who went to the queen, who immediately consented. The archbishop came, and continued afterwards to pray by her bedside, morning and evening. But the prayers of the archbishop were far from satisfying the scruples of the orthodox, who further required that Her Majesty should receive the Holy Communion. How far the archbishop spoke to the queen on this solemn subject is impossible to say. The matter was one between the royal sufferer and her God. Caroline was, in the wide sense of the word, a religious woman. one whose religion was not on her lips but in her life. She had a firm faith in God and trust in His mercy, but she was not, and never had been, an orthodox Christian. In health, because she conceived it to be her duty as Queen Consort, she had scrupulously conformed to the rites of the Church of England, but now, in the presence of death, she felt it necessary to be sincere in her convictions and dispense with them. The Archbishop, who was a godly and tolerant prelate, and who knew the Queen's views, probably forbore to press her on the matter, and we may take it for granted that the Queen did not receive the last sacrament. It was rumored about the court that the Archbishop had celebrated the communion of the sick in the royal chamber, but at last moment the Queen refused to receive. When the Archbishop came out of the room, he was surrounded by courtiers and ladies-in-waiting in the antechambers, who eagerly asked him, "My lord, has the Queen received?" The Archbishop eluded the question and rebuked them by saying, "The Queen is in a very heavily disposition." Some, more officious than the rest, told him that it was his duty to reconcile the Queen to the Prince of Wales. The Archbishop replied that, whenever the Queen had spoken to him about this unhappy division in the royal family, she had spoken with such good sense that it would be impertinent for him to offer her advice on the subject. By some authorities it is stated that the Queen at the last forgave the Prince, and one goes so far as to declare that she sent her blessings and forgiveness to her son, and told Sir Robert Walpole that she would have sent for him with pleasure. But prudence forbade the interview, as it might irritate and embarrass the king. On the other hand, Hervey was silent on this point, though he makes the Queen several times during her illness express resentment against her son, which was perhaps natural, as his insults were very recent. Her enemies afterwards declared that she refused the prince her forgiveness, though he sent again and again to humbly beseech her blessing. There is a conflict of testimony here, and the Queen may well have the benefit of the doubt, but for all her life she had labored in the cause of peace, and striven to prevent discord in the royal family. The Queen still lingered on, her brain and faculties clear till the last, but the king's mind was giving way under the strain. He was conscious of this to some extent, for he told his pages that if he were unreasonable and chiding and swearing at them, they were not to mind it. Lord Hervey, in his grim and ghastly account of the Queen's deathbed, mocks at the lamentations of the king and jeers at his behavior. Yet there is every reason to believe that his grief was absolutely sincere, and in the presence of so great a sorrow, these gibes could surely have been stilled. It was all very human and very pitiful. The king was not one of those who could suffer and be still. His grief was noisy and hilarious. He talked incessantly during those trying days to all whom he met of the Queen's many virtues and the great and irreparable loss her death would be to him and the nation. He said the same to his wife over and over again, and they babbled their love together with tears and broken words. She knew now that she was first with him, had always been first with him, and their love was as fresh and fragrant as when he wooed her in the rose gardens of Ansbach long ago. Yet, evidently overwrought by long watching and emotion, the king would sometimes break off in the middle of his vows of love and devotion to chide her in the old peevish fashion. Her pain made her very restless, and she complained that she could not sleep. "How the devil should you sleep," burst forth the king, "when you will never lie still a moment?" Or again, when the Queen, at his bidding, lay perfectly still, the king would rail at her for looking straight before her, like a calf waiting for its throat to be cut. But Caroline knew better than to blame him for these rough words, which were more welcome to her than sweetest music. Her wifely obedience never failed, even at the last. The doctors said that her strength must be kept up, so the king was always forcing down her throat all sorts of food and drink, The poor queen would swallow whatever he wished, and when he thanked her, she would say, "It is the last service I can do you." But her stomach was not so complacent, and she could only retain the food for a few minutes. Then she would bravely try again. For her own sake she wished not to live. For his she would fain have done so. So the days wore on, the queen almost apologizing for being so long in dying. Thursday, Friday, and Saturday passed without change. But on Sunday, November 20th, 1737, the 11th day of her illness, she grew weaker every hour. About 10 o'clock in the evening, the end came quietly and suddenly. Her last word was pray. The king was with her when she passed away, and in an agony of grief he kissed the face and hands of the dead queen. End of chapter 15.
Section 16 of Caroline the Illustrious, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Caroline the Illustrious, Volume 2, by William Henry Wilkins. Illustrissima Carolina. Queen Caroline's funeral took place on the evening of Saturday, December the 13th, 1737, in Westminster Abbey. It was her special request that her obsequies should be as quiet and simple as possible, and the king respected her wish, though he commanded a general mourning and arranged every detail of the ceremonial. During the month that elapsed between the queen's death and her funeral, the body, encased in a lead coffin and an outer one of English oak, rested in the chamber wherein she died, which was transformed into a chapelle ardente for the time being. The walls were hung with purple and black, and tall tapers burned night and day around the bier. The doors were guarded by gentlemen pensioners with their axes reversed, and the king allowed no one to enter the room except himself and those who watched by the body. The night before the funeral a brief service was held in the death chamber by the Archbishop of Canterbury, which the king, the Duke of Cumberland, and the Princesses Amelia, Caroline, Mary, and Louisa attended. This was the king's farewell of all that was mortal of his queen, for he was too ill and too much overcome by grief to attend the funeral. The service over, the coffin was privately conveyed by torchlight from St. James's Palace to the prince's chamber adjoining the House of Lords. Here the late queen's pages watched all night, and were joined in the morning by Her Majesty's maids of honour. The body lay in state all that day, guarded by 20 gentlemen pensioners. At 6 o'clock in the evening the funeral procession started from the prince's chamber and passed through the old palace yard to the great north door of Westminster Abbey by means of a covered way lined throughout with black. Though the funeral was officially described as private, the procession was a long one, and included the ministers, the court officials, the physicians who attended the queen in her last illness, all those who held places in her household, and many peers. Sir Robert Walpole followed his royal mistress to her last resting place. The queen's chamberlain carried her crown on a black velvet cushion, and walked immediately before the coffin, which was borne by 10 yeomen of the guard, and covered with a large pall of black velvet, lined with black silk, with a fine holland sheet adorned with 10 large escutcheons painted on satin, under a canopy of black velvet. 6 dukes acted as pallbearers, and 10 members of the Privy Council bore the canopy. In an equal line on either side marched the gentlemen pensioners with their arms reversed. Behind the coffin walked the Princess Amelia as chief mourner. She was supported by the Duke of Grafton and the Duke of Dorset, and her train was borne by the Duchess of St. Albans and the Duchess of Montague. The Princess Amelia was followed by a long train of ladies, including nearly all the duchesses and a large number of other peeresses. The late Queen's ladies of the bedchamber, maids of honour, and bedchamber women, The chief mourner and all the ladies wore long veils of black crape. The Dean and Canons of Westminster wearing their copes, and the choir, augmented by the choir boys of the Chapel Royal in their habits of scarlet and gold, bearing wax tapers in their hands, met the coffin at the north door of the Abbey, and the procession wended its way through the north and south aisles to Henry VII's chapel, the choir chanting the while the psalm Domine Refugium. The coffin was rested by the side of the open grave, hard by the tomb of Henry VII, and the burial service was proceeded with up to the committal prayers. The Garter King of Arms then stepped forward and proclaimed the late Queen's style and titles in a loud voice. Thus it had passed, Almighty God to take out of the transitory life to his divine mercy the late most high, most mighty, and most excellent Princess Caroline, by the grace of God, Queen Consort of the most high, most mighty, and most excellent monarch, George II, by the grace of God, King of Great Britain, France, and Ireland, defender of the faith, whom God bless and preserve with a long life, health and honour, and all worldly happiness. Then the choir sang the beautiful anthem which Handel had composed especially for the occasion. The ways of Zion do mourn, and she is in bitterness. All her people sigh and hang down their heads to the ground. How are the mighty fallen! She that was great among the nations and princesses of the provinces, how are the mighty fallen! When the ear heard her, then it blessed her, and when the eye saw her, it gave witness of her. How are the mighty fallen! She that was great among the nations and princess of the provinces. She delivered the poor that cried, the fatherless, and him that had no helper. Kindness, meekness, and comfort were in her tongue. If there was any virtue, and if there was any praise, she thought on those things. Her body is buried in peace, but her name liveth for evermore. When the last notes of the anthem had died away, the procession returned to the north door of the Abbey in the same order as it had come. The coffin under its canopy, with tall tapers burning on either side, was left in the chapel. Later a short service was held privately, when it was lowered to the vault and placed in the large stone sarcophagus prepared for it. The king remained inconsolable for many months. He saw no one at first but his daughters, and when he was compelled to see Walpole or some other minister on important business, he could talk of nothing but his loss and the great qualities of the late queen. Many thought that he would not long survive her. He seemed completely broken down. The genuineness of his sorrow showed itself in various ways. By her will the queen had left everything to him, but it transpired that she had little to leave except her house at Richmond, her jewels, and the obligations she had incurred by her charities. When her heart was touched by cases of poverty, sickness, or sorrow, she would not only relieve immediate necessities, but often grant pensions for life. These pensions, it was found, amounted to nearly £13,000 a year. The king took the full burden on his own shoulders. "I will have no one the poorer for her death but myself," he said. He also paid the salaries of every member of her household until he could otherwise provide for them. One morning, soon after the Queen's death, he woke early and sent for Baron Borgmann, one of his Hanoverian suite. When he came, the king said, "I hear you have a picture of the Queen which she gave you, and that it is a better likeness than any in my possession. Bring it to me here." Borgmann brought it to the king, who said it was very like Her Majesty, and burst into tears. "Put it," he said presently, "upon that chair at the foot of my bed, and leave me until I ring the bell." 2 hours passed before he rang, and then he was quite calm. "Take the picture away," he said to its owner. "I never yet saw a woman worthy to buckle her shoe." Some little time later he was playing cards one evening with his daughters. Some queens were dealt to him, and no sooner did he pick up the cards and perceive them than he burst into tears and was unable to go on with the game. Princess Amelia guarded against a repetition of the scene the following night by privately ordering all the queens to be taken out of the pack. The king was very morbid in his grief and much given to dwelling upon the material aspect of death. He was very superstitious and a firm believer in ghouls and vampires. Lord Wentworth gives an illustration of this in a letter he wrote to his father, Lord Strafford, shortly after the Queen's funeral. Saturday night, between 1 and 2 o'clock, the king waked out of a dream very uneasy, and ordered the vault where the Queen is to be broken out immediately, and have the coffin also opened, and went in a hackneyed chair through the Horse Guards to Westminster Abbey, and back again to bed. I think it is the strangest thing that could be. In a subsequent letter he refers to it again. The story about the king was true, for Mr. Wallop heard of one who saw him go through the Horse Guards on Saturday night with 10 footmen before the chair. They went afterwards to Westminster Abbey. 33 years later, George II was buried by his Queen's side, and as a last proof of his devotion he left orders that one side of her coffin should be removed, and one side of his taken away, so that their bones should mingle, and in death be not divided. Caroline was widely mourned by all classes of her husband's subjects. Even those disaffected to the House of Hanover admitted the high qualities of the Queen, and the Jacobites tempered their judgment, when they remembered that she had always been on the side of mercy. Only from the Prince of Wales's household and from those who supported him came any discordant note, and it must be admitted that some of these were very discordant indeed. In the 18th century personal and political hatreds were carried beyond the grave, and some of the epigrams and mock epitaphs composed by the Queen's enemies after her death form anything but pleasant reading. The fact that she did not see the Prince of Wales during her last illness was seized upon as a pretext for attacking her memory. And unforgiven dies, cried Chesterfield with bitter sarcasm, while Pope with more subtle irony wrote, "Hang the sad verse on Carolina's urn, and hail her passage to the realms of rest, all parts performed, and all her children blessed." But these outbursts were overwhelmed in the spontaneous tribute of affection and respect paid to the dead Queen on all sides. Her loss was felt to be a national calamity. "The Lord hath taken away his anointed with a stroke," cried a preacher. "The breath of our nostrils is taken away. The great princess is no more, under whose shadow we said we should be safe, and promised ourselves lasting peace. She whom future generations will know as Caroline the Illustrious." And indeed the Queen's pre-eminent qualities fit her for no lesser epithet. Caroline's character was formed on bold and generous lines, and her defects only served to bring into stronger relief the purity of her life, the loftiness of her motives, and the excellence of her wisdom. She was a good hater, but a true friend, patient under suffering, strong in adversity, fond of prayer, yet using it always for the good of others. In the words which Frederick the Great applied to her early mentor, the Queen of Prussia, she had a great soul. End of section 16. End of Caroline the Illustrious, Volume 2, by William Henry Wilkins.